In the midst, folks, of the shrinking economy and job layoffs and downsizing and $4 a gallon gasoline and cancer and heart conditions and chronic illnesses and family problems, life is good. Life is good. It isn't perfect, or great at times, but it's good. I used to ask an elderly gentleman from Memorial Church when I was down in Williamson on the West Virginia-Kentucky border how he was. His health wasn't real good, and there were times that I was really concerned about Sampy's health. He did have some serious medical conditions. And I would ask him, Sampy, how are you today? Wow, preacher, he said, I'm on top of the ground. Sampy's no longer on top of the ground. But I will always remember his optimism for each day. Always. Don't determine that you're going to be happy when you get this or that or when you meet that special person. You can decide that you're going to be happy today. So I've shared with some of you, many of you, 6 years ago I got out of the hospital. And I decided that I was going to enjoy every day, no matter what the day brought. Because I was just blessed to have the day. I think possibly that is probably the attitude of many cancer survivors as well. Just blessed to have the day. Life is bad might be a better way to describe what the early Christians of our text had experienced. There were 11 disciples, remember? One had just committed suicide. And they were hunkered down in Jerusalem, wondering what was next after their beloved friend and rabbi has ascended to heaven. And while Pentecost brought new power, it also brought new persecution. Acts reads like a police report from the roughest neighborhood in town. Peter and John get arrested. All the apostles are jailed and flogged and given a preaching restraining order. Stephen stoned to death. The church is persecuted and driven out of Jerusalem. A death bounty is put on Paul's head. James is beheaded. And on and on and on through the first centuries. It makes our sour economic and other problems pale in comparison. Life is bad, bad, bad. Right? No, it's not. No, it's not. Life for the apostles was good. So we have to ask, how can it be said that anyone who's part of a group that's been arrested, threatened, put in prison, beat, and killed, how can that life be good? And the text for this morning gives us some ideas, which I think must be rediscovered in Christian community today. 3 ideas particularly are reflected in our text this morning. First of all, common purpose, replacing individualism with shared biblical values. Secondly, commonplace, replacing isolation with a renewed focus on community within our neighborhoods. And thirdly, common possessions, replacing consumerism with voluntary resource interdependence. Despite facing dreadful religious persecution, the early church had a common purpose, a common place, and common possessions. They existed, folks, in community in which life was good, and it can be good for us too, if we take these values to heart. First, let's look at the common purpose. And before you're here, itch to stand up on the back of your neck. Okay? Over the radical concept of shared possessions. Well, that's what preacher talking about now. I went out and worked 40-hour weeks or 50 or 60-hour weeks. It was me who put in the time and earned the money. It was me who invested it wisely and am getting a generous return from it now. It's mine. What's the preacher talking about sharing my stuff? Before the hair stands up on the back of your neck, I want you to note the important opening verse which makes everything else possible. And the verse is this. Now the whole group of those who believed was of one heart and soul. The whole group who believed was of one heart and soul. This is a defining characteristic of early Christian unity. The story of Jesus and his teaching gave groups of local Christians a mission statement around which they organized themselves. Commitment to shared values made these early churches radically different from their culture. And as the new converts gathered together, they began sharing life in new ways, governed by a new purpose. In Acts 2, they took the teachings of the apostles, fellowshiped in the temple and in one another's homes, witnessed miracles, praised God, and saw daily additional converts. Commonplace. You know what? I'm going to miss some of them, but we can call, we can text, we can email, we can instant message, we can Facebook, we can Twitter, we can, what else? There's a bunch of others out there, I know there are. We can do all of these things. We can drive or we can fly to see people who live clear across the continent, a trip that's equivalent to 100 days of biblical travel away from us. But this has made us a more fractured people. Not connected people. A more fractured people. We need to develop Christian community within a geographic community. And where we share proximity, there are four essential characteristics that emerge in this common place. First is spontaneity. Crossing paths unintentionally or dropping in on short or no notice. Spontaneity describes the interaction that the Connors family and I had yesterday over at the mall. Spontaneity, just bang. Well, I didn't see you there. I didn't see you there either. And the conversation begins. And we have a good time. The second essential characteristic that emerges from commonplace is availability. Being close enough to lend an ear or a hand to an immediate need. The third thing is frequency. The early church met daily. You know, when I received my first appointment down in Morgantown, 5 little country churches outside of Morgantown, and I replaced a Korean pastor who had been there on the charge. He not only pastored that charge, but the Korean church that met in the old Drummond Chapel, there on the campus of Drummond Chapel in Morgantown. You knew it. He came to Washington Lands after he left there. That's right. I see you smiling. You know that Korean church met every weekday morning at 5 o'clock in the morning. 5 o'clock in the morning. Before they left to go to work, they gathered at the church. Just thought I'd share that with you. The early church met daily. And then the fourth thing from commonplace is hospitality. They shared meals. Shared meals are the historical centerpiece of the closest relationships. We always make fun of our covered dish dinners. That was like eating. Well, some of us do, yeah. And there's nothing better than sharing it around the table with other like-minded folks in fellowship, is there? start looking around us, and we should look to build community within community. And the fourth thing, and the one that can make the hair stand up on Western Christians' necks, is common possessions. Perhaps the most staggering feature of the early church was the one that today's text focuses on primarily. There was one thing that made it clear that God was powerfully changing people. Believers disregarded private ownership in favor of a common purpose. Folks, there's no way that happens apart from God. No way. Shared stuff. Give as you can. Take as you need. I own nothing. We own everything. That's radical community where life is good. But you know what? And I'm not talking politics here. You don't ever hear me talk politics from this pulpit. But big government can't do this. Only hearts changed by God can do this. And in the West, this idea feels idealistic. This concept feels idealistic at best. Certainly it isn't taken seriously outside the church, and probably not even there is it taken seriously. Can you imagine this kind of behavior during the mortgage crisis? A family selling their vacation home to prevent their neighbors foreclosing. No way. That's the job of government, we say. Look around the congregation. It's not like this is our calling card as believers either. No one can expect us to live Acts 4, right? They can't expect us to do it. We not only can be expected to live Acts 4, we are expected to. Developing an Acts community requires Christians to believe that they are not the owners of things. They are the manager of what God has entrusted to them. Before I moved here, I pastored in a rural area. Several farmers, large tracts of land, good land over along the Cheat River, down on the river bottoms, where the hay grew high and thick and the corn grew tall. And if you went to the courthouse and you looked on the court records, you would find their names on the deeds for those properties. Some of you here have deeds for properties. And the record at the courthouse said that so-and-so owned this piece of property. Wrong. The property belongs to God. And God has given it to that farmer or that landowner to manage. Radical concept. Huh? Not so radical. Maybe for the West it is. We are not the owners of things. We are the managers of things that God has entrusted to us. They are, and we are to be open to God's leading on how they should be used and share that which He has given to them and to us. Money and possessions are tools for others, and not just sustenance or indulgence for self. Sharing our financial resources is an issue of deep sacrifice. Truth is, sharing the good life is a good way to live. Life always seems to have plenty of difficulties and plenty of suffering to spread around. What we need is a group of people around us to shoulder the burdens of life. We need people consumerism. We need a biblical community. I want you to consider this. The church is the only cooperative society in the world that exists for its non-members. The church is the only cooperative society in the world that exists for its non-members. Contrary to what you might think, this church does not exist for you. And this church does not exist for me. It's not all about what makes me happy in church and what makes me sad in church and whether I like the preacher or I don't like the preacher. It's not about any of that. It's about those outside the church. And how do we touch their lives for Jesus Christ? How do we make disciples? How can we in this community reach out to those who aren't members of it and make disciples for Christ? That's why we exist. Also, we can have a nice organ, and I love the nice organ and the guy who plays it. But we don't exist for that. For the nice pews and the carpet and the nice facilities that we have, we don't exist for that. We exist so that we can reach